Hello, people. I wanted to do a live video because I've been really not feeling the whole editing thing because life has just been a lot lately. So I wanted to talk about something that I think is pretty important, and I'm going to be leaving this up rather than just doing it live. Like, really, the only reason I'm recording this live is so that I don't have to edit it after. That's really the only reason. Um, but I wanted to talk about why abuse, and I'm also going to say like neglect. I don't want to just reference like abuse because that typically refers to really like strongly terrible deliberate mishandling of horses. I want to include neglect in this because I'd say that neglect is probably more common than what I would call actual abuse towards horses. But the fact of the matter is both those things are really widespread for horses as a species. And I wanted to talk about why I think that is. Um, First, obviously, one of the biggest problems with the horse industry is that there is a lot of denial of new information and there's a lack of openness to new information when it conflicts with what people have been taught to believe. And what I personally notice, especially when sharing things that go against the status quo, is that there's a lot of people who are seeking confirmation bias, which is a logical fallacy. And for those who don't know what confirmation bias is, it's essentially where you already hold a certain opinion and you're only seeking information that supports that opinion and that belief system. You're not seeking out the information that conflicts with it because you're only looking to confirm your current belief systems. And that's probably one of the most common responses that I see horse people give to new information when it calls to question practices that they don't want to have to question. And I used to be guilty of this too. And so this isn't like a dig at anyone. It's just like a simple fact where a lot of horse people are not seeking out new information with curiosity and openness to changing their perspectives. They're only going into looking at information that's not going to make them feel uncomfortable. And I think that one of the biggest human factors when it comes to reforming the horse world and improving horse welfare is people aren't wanting to deal with being uncomfortable. They run from discomfort and they view any information or any action that makes them feel uncomfortable as inherently bad because they view that discomfort as being a bad thing. And that means that the information itself is bad. But when we're trying to shift a system that has run the way it has been for so many years and where certain belief systems have been so strong and consistently perpetuated, it's never going to be comfortable to shift those mindsets. It's never going to be comfortable to start promoting a different way of seeing things. There's always going to be discomfort associated with that. And oftentimes when you're learning things, especially when you're having to unlearn things rather than just learning new information, it's going to be uncomfortable. I would say unlearning is a lot harder than just learning because unlearning requires you to let go of previous biases and then also be open to new information. So horse abuse and neglect is allowed to continue being perpetuated in the horse world because of the human denial of new information and the lack of openness to the new information and the amount of faith that horse people put into status. Because what you notice is that a lot of horse people base whether or not something is accurate information off of the prestige of the person giving that information. So if it's like an upper level Olympic level rider, that person's going to be viewed with more credibility than someone who is like an equine scientist, an equine behaviorist, even though they have less credibility. And that's not to say that those people aren't talented riders, but I think that one of the biggest shifts that needs to start happening in the horse world is that people need to recognize the fact that someone being a good rider does not mean that they are a good horse person or that they are knowledgeable in horse behavior and the care of horses in general, because there's a lot of common belief systems for horse care and training that are actually detrimental to horses. And they're so common that people view their commonality as a reason why they're okay. And there's a difference between common and normal. There's a lot of common stress behaviors that we see in horses that Queso just sat in my lap. So if he wants to be on camera, I'll adjust the camera a little bit. There's a lot of common stress behaviors we see in horses that are common, but they're not normal behaviors for horses. So we have this whole industry of people who actually don't know what normal horse behavior even looks like. They don't know what is normal for horses and what normal care for horses looks like and how these horses are supposed to behave. And when you grow up being surrounded by horses with very disordered behavior, who are very unhappy, very stressed, and who are constantly exhibiting these behaviors, and you see them at different barns, not even just the barn that you ride at, you view that as normal horse behavior when in fact it is just common horse behavior. This was the case for me growing up because I grew up in show barns, and there was a lot of horses who had stall vices and other stress behaviors that were always present. And since I got into it young too, I learned to never really question those things. Like initially, I probably did ask some questions about why those behaviors existed because just typical childhood curiosity. But as soon as I got the answer and I kept seeing these behaviors, I believed what I was told and I ran with it. And then the problem with that is we have a bunch of people who do that and then they run with it into adulthood. And when you have clung to certain belief systems for that many years, it becomes even harder to let go of them because you become very entrenched in it. And what I personally find is that I think a lot of people view the sharing of information that makes them uncomfortable as a personal attack. And they also view acknowledging that the way that they've been doing things in the past is not okay and probably shouldn't continue. They view that acknowledging that makes them a bad person, when in fact, it's actually a huge sign of growth and positive character to be able to look at your previous actions, be like, I don't want to continue doing something that I've now found out is harmful, and then make the changes accordingly. But a lot of people view admitting that they're wrong as admitting fault and admitting that they're not a good person. And this extends far outside of the horse world too, because it's seen in like relationships as well. When someone does something that hurts their friend or their partner and they have their partner or their friend comes towards them and is like, hey, like you did this thing that hurt my feelings. A lot of people will get defensive and try to justify why they acted in the way that they did instead of just acknowledging the fact that their intent wasn't to hurt the person and that they didn't mean to, and then listening to how they could avoid doing that in the future. A lot of people jump to the defense because they view that as protecting their character and preserving the fact that they're not a bad person, when in reality, the lack of acknowledgement for the hurt that they've caused is what makes them look like a bad person. But that's not to say I don't think that the horse world is filled with, oh my God, Queso, what are you doing? We have a kitten just like sitting on my microphone cord. Sir, can you not? Can we just, no, we're not going to play with that. Excuse me. Thank you. But we have an industry full of people who don't really want to own up to like where things might be wrong, because they don't want to have to be perceived as a bad person. And I think like the human ego portion of like systemic change in the horse world is the biggest hurdle. It's not even necessarily that putting in new welfare protocols or changing the way that we manage horses would be all that difficult if everyone was participating to make those changes. But it's the fact that for the humans, admitting that there's need for change in the first place is very, very difficult. And they don't want to have to admit to that. So horse abuse is very common in the industry, as is neglect of horses, because people will engage in training methods and care practices believing that they are ethical and believing that that's the way horses need to be trained, handled, and cared for, because that's what they've been taught. And they see no problem with it. So we have a bunch of people who have no idea that what they're doing is even wrong. And then when it's brought to their attention that something could be wrong with it, that it could be harmful to the horse, that bothers them because their intent is to not harm the horse. But then instead of being open to the information and considering whether or not there might be need for change, they double down and deny it and then lash out at anyone who has like presented the information to them, even if it's just information. So it becomes really hard to prevent people from causing harm to horses when they don't view it as harmful and when they've been taught that that is normal, necessary training and care. And there's this belief system that a lot of these training protocols make horses safer to handle and deal with, when that's not actually the case. And in my opinion, like I would argue that horses are one of the most abused domesticated animals out there, and that the vast majority of horses, I think, are missing at least one of their most basic and crucial needs. And this, again, is not a dig at people. It's just like presenting a fact. Like, for example, horses' three crucial needs, like friends, freedom, forage, and then, of course, like water, shelter, and all that stuff. most horses are usually missing one of those three things. A lot of horses do not get social access to other horses. A lot of horses do not really have anything that resembles freedom because they're confined to small spaces. A lot of horses do not have free access to forage and go hours without eating, which is detrimental to them, both physically because of causing stomach ulcers and other digestive problems, but also behaviorally because foraging is such an innate and crucial behavior to like their dynamic and how they interact with the world, that when they cannot do that, it causes them emotional distress too. So it's not even the physical component of it. It's the fact that when they're prevented from engaging in these crucial behaviors that are so ingrained in their way of living, that they suffer emotionally from that as well. Um, and I would say most horses are missing one of those needs, especially if you look at like traditional boarding barn environments. There's not very many farms in a lot of areas that actually meet all of those needs, like especially in more urban areas. Like where I live, it would be very hard to find a barn where they have group turnout year round and where they also feed like free choice hay and whatnot, because they're just not constructed in that way. And that also is a hurdle for improving horse welfare, is looking at the general construction of barns and how it would need to be modified in order to have it be most welfare centered. And there's expense associated with that as well. But I personally don't think it's as difficult as what a lot of people think that it would be. I think the most difficult part is going to be addressing all of the behavioral problems in horses that humans have created because of the components of their needs that have been left out on such a massive basis. So we have a huge portion of horses that do not have proper social skills because they've been deprived of social contact with other horses. And if they never get the chance to interact with other horses, especially in a herd setting, they're not going to know how to interact with horses normally. And then this can create fighting and aggression and potential injuries and so on and so forth. And a lot of people don't want to deal with that. And they'll look at a horse who's struggling to integrate into a herd and they'll use that as a reason why the horse is never going to be able to do that, when really it's just an indicator that they're going to need help. They're going to essentially need therapy to get to the point where they could be put back out into a herd. And it's hard because also it's like, I think that there's a need for more accountability on the part of humans and to actually look at like what our actions look like at face value when we're solely looking at the needs of the animal. So for example, when people have a horse who shows aggression to other horses and they go, oh, well, they hate other horses, so I don't want them out. Or if they have a horse who paces and runs around their paddock when they're turned out and they go, oh, they don't like turnout, so they prefer being in their stall because they're calmer. And it's like, yes, both of those things stress them out, but that doesn't mean that it's not a need. Like most horses would like eating an entire bag of grain if you left it out for them, and they would gorge themselves to the point where it could kill them. That doesn't mean that it's healthy for them. So there's this important thing to note, that we create disordered behaviors, and it's important to not view those disordered behaviors as a preference for the horse. The other thing to note is just to like look at like what our decisions look like on paper. So another issue that a lot of people have, and this is why a lot of horses don't get social turnout, is they'll be like, oh, well, my horse has back shoes, so they cannot go out with other horses. And that's where we need to kind of pause for a moment and look at the fact and go, like, is it fair to horses to deprive them of one of their most innate basic needs so that we can ride them? And like what, and if they need hind shoes, why aren't we exploring other options that are not metal shoes that would be less dangerous in a herd setting that horses could have if they need to wear hind shoes? Because it shouldn't be a situation where the horse is having to take a loss with one of their basic needs just so that humans can enjoy them and keep them in a certain setting. And again, a lot of people don't like hearing that, but it's a simple fact. The other thing that's interesting with horses in particular that like would not fly with dogs, and honestly, I've almost wanted to do this just as an experiment to see how people would react. Um, and I still might when I get another dog eventually. But like, if someone got a really high energy dog breed and proceeded to kennel it for 20 plus hours a day and not exercise it properly, not provide it with enrichment, and the dog was going crazy because of that, overwhelmingly you'd have people say that is cruel. You should not have gotten a dog breed like that if you cannot properly provide the needs for it. However, with horses, when people cannot adequately provide their needs, there's a lot of excuses where people are like, oh, I live in a city, this is the best I can do, or like they're fine, and they deny the fact that the horse is even lacking in needs at all. And it's interesting is if you reverse the roles with any other animal, for the most part, people would not be okay with it. They would be like, you're not more entitled to having an animal than you are to providing their needs if you choose to have the animal. And yet, this is something that is so common in the horse world. And I think it's where we need to take a step back from like our own interests and trying to advocate for ourselves and consider whether or not, like on paper, our actions are fair to the horse. Because ultimately, if we cannot provide basic needs, why is it the animal's job to just cope with not having those needs provided simply because we want to have them? And that's honestly just a, as hard as it is for a lot of people to hear, it is a simple fact. We are not more entitled to having horses than we are to providing adequate care for them. And wanting an animal is not a good enough reason to get one when you knowingly cannot provide proper care for them. And like at this point, there's so much scholarly research showing the damage that certain common care practices are causing horses. So it's really not something that's up for debate or up for opinion anymore. Like it's not a matter of opinion. It's just it is what it is. And it's a matter of people actually being willing to accept the information for what it is and make changes accordingly. And a lot of people don't want to accept the information because they don't want to have to make those changes. They don't want to have to do the hard work of thinking of alternatives to the care that they provide their horse and what options are actually within their power. Because in a lot of cases, I do think that more people have more options than what they think. I think that a lot of people would be able to commute a little bit further to go to the barn and find a place that has a more suitable setup, or they would be able to at least make adjustments in the place that they're at that could immediately improve the life of the horse, or like reconsider your location if it's not suitable for horses and if they cannot live there without being deprived of needs. There's like a lot of different avenues that people should be looking at instead of just being like, oh, well, like this is all I can do, so the horse just has to cope with it, because the logic doesn't fly with any other species. And like the interesting thing that I've noticed is that there is a huge disconnect between what people view as acceptable for horses and how those same people view every single other animals. And like a great example of this is like when the movie Blackfish came out, a lot of horse people were like outraged and saying like how cruel to the whales it was and like how unfair that was and like how they're going crazy, the enclosures are too small, there's no enrichment, blah 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 blah. And they would be advocating for the whales in that context, but then if you reverse the roles, they don't do the same for horses. They don't look at how unengaging and boring the average stall is for the horse and how confining it is for them and how abnormal it is for them and how they develop abnormal behaviors because of it. Um, yeah, thank you. Queso says thank you to everyone saying that he's cute. He's just vibing. Right now, he's like really chill, but he's actually really chaotic and crazy a lot of the time. Like, I don't know what he's training for, but he just goes sprinting through the house very often throughout the day, and he's training for something. Don't know what, but like he works hard. But yeah, like with horses, there's like a huge disconnect because the same people can notice problems within other animals' care, but they don't want to look at that through horses. And it's because of this conditioning process where we've been made to feel like a lot of super abnormal things are normal when really they aren't. And it really sucks. Like, honestly, the more you become aware of this, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It sucks to like start to learn more about this stuff and to actually be open into looking into the information to the point where you read it with an open mind and you look into like how to determine a credible source and critically think for yourself and just look at it for what it is without your personal bias being involved. It will forever change how you see the horse industry and how you approach working with horses and taking care of them. And it can be really sad because you have to grieve the loss of what you believe to be true, what you thought the industry was, what you thought was healthy and normal for horses. You have to grieve the loss of all of that. So like I find that a lot of people don't want to give in to that level of awareness because it involves a lot of grief and a ton of discomfort and probably pivoting from the trajectory of like journey that you had, because you won't be able to do things the same anymore because you've gained a level of awareness that causes you to think more critically about like what you're doing and how it actually impacts your horses. A few months ago, or like probably almost a year ago now, because time has been flying by, I made a post about my horses and how if I was ever in the position where I needed to return them to a boarding facility where they would all be separated from each other and in individual like stall paddock type situations with small space, that I would either move them out of the area, even if it meant that I wouldn't be able to see them regularly at all, or I would find them homes where they could adequately provide for them. And a lot of people were pissed off and they were like just calling me out on that post and giving me a million and one excuses as to why that doesn't work for them and their horses when I was talking about my own horses. Me advocating for my own horses and saying that I would sacrifice my own enjoyment of them for their well being triggered a lot of people to the point where they felt guilty enough about their own care that they had to argue with me on a post about my own horses. And like for context purposes, where I live in British Columbia in the lower mainland, like right near the US border, it's a very like rainy area and land here is also insanely expensive. Like the cost of living has gone up dramatically over the years. And it's expensive. So like a lot of the boarding facilities are not set up to have horses out together year round. Um, and a lot of them are a situation where the horses are in a stall or a small paddock for most of the time and that they don't have social access, or like at most it's like over a fence. So like if I was in the position where I couldn't have them on a rental property where I'm doing the primary care and where it's set up to a standard where I feel happy with what they have access to, then I would be reconsidering what my care of them would look like and what my access of them would look like. And I would probably be looking at moving them more rurally to where there's more available land so that they can live together in a herd and not be separated from their friends. Because for me, it's a no-brainer. Like I could not cope with seeing the behavioral change that I know would happen if I moved my horses out of their current situation into one where their needs are not being properly met, because I would see their behavior shift in such a dramatic way where they're very clearly unhappy. And I couldn't cope with like I wouldn't even want to hang out with my horses and see them in that mental state. And that is why I would be comfortable moving them further away where I could not see them, or sending them to like a friend or someone who could care for them in like in a group setting, because it would be less painful to me to just go without seeing them for lengthy periods of time than it would be seeing them every day when they are miserable. And that was like, that's a no-brainer for me now. Is that a decision I would have made like a decade ago? No, definitely not. I would have centered myself in my decision making a decade ago because I was less aware of how these things actually impacted horses, and I would have viewed a lot of the disordered behavior as just being personality related rather than the horses having like struggles with the life that they're living. But it's really interesting because there's this huge disconnect, but then also there's like kind of like little glimmers of where you can tell that people, there's a part of them that does recognize that there is something a little off and that there is something a little wrong, because they'll get defensive over how other people care for their animals and be trying to justify their own care when it's not even been criticized slightly in a certain post. Or like I've seen people on like actual studies in the comment sections when they're shared, basically arguing why their horse is an exception to what is like a very well-rounded study and what's like a topic that's been studied a lot. For example, like the stress that like isolation and stalling causes horses. A lot of people will argue why their horse is an exception to that instead of considering the fact that perhaps their perception of the horse is the one that the thing that is skewed, not their horse being like a special little snowflake. Another excuse that I see people use a lot is they'll go, horses are individuals, and they'll use this as a reason to negate information that is done on large sample sizes of horses that is taking into account just how they are built as a species, both behaviorally and just like how their physical bodies are built and why they function in the way that they do. They'll say horses are individuals, and this will be a common excuse to try to be like, okay, well, you can't apply this to every horse, but it's like saying people are individuals. You can't say that every human being needs to breathe oxygen. And it's like, yes, you can. You can say that. You can also say that every human being needs water, because there's certain things that people need. And humans are also a social species, and we know that they suffer from confinement and isolation in similar ways to horses, because social access is important. And like with humans, to an extent, like having animals can help supplement our social access. But with horses, Unlike with dogs or cats, a human is not an adequate replacement for living with a horse. One, because horses don't get to come into our houses with us and be with us all the time. And two, because even if they could, they have such a different need and lifestyle than us, like where they're meant to be moving around and exploring for lengthy periods of time, that there's just no way any human could reasonably do that for their horse on their own with no other horse friends and actually make up for the deficit that would be not having other horse friends. It's just not possible. Whereas like with cats, or like cats still do better with a friend. So that's a bad example. But with dogs, we've like domesticated them to a point where it is an adequate replacement, where a lot of dogs get way more out of their connections with people than they might even with other dogs. Some dogs are more social than others, but a lot of dogs could take or leave interactions with other dogs, or they don't like other dogs at all. My dog is one of those dogs. She doesn't like most dogs. Um, but she likes her people. She's choosy about who she lets in her circle, but it's like people are an adequate social replacement for her. But she also lives in my house. She sleeps in my bed with me. She often comes to work with me. She goes walking with me. She goes camping with me. Horses wouldn't have that lifestyle. There'd be many, many hours, more hours than not, where they'd be existing by themselves without a person around. So the connection with humans, while horses can connect with humans and they can get like they can have viably close relationships with people, it isn't a replacement to socialization with other horses. They need to have access to other horses. And this is like one of the factors that is so disregarded in the horse world that it's honestly wild, because there's just so much research that shows that that need is there. The other thing, like pertaining to like abuse, and I'm going to use that term really like lightly in this case, but there's a lot of equipment that is on the market for training horses that is entirely reliant on causing horses discomfort in order to control them. And we also have to look at what that means. We need to be honest with ourselves about how the equipment we're using works. And when we're looking at like bits and like certain types of training equipment where it's essentially trying to force the horse into an unnatural position, or even if it is a more natural position, they're trying to force them into a static position for an extended period of time, or you're using bits to get them to respond to immediately and be less strong in the bridle. A lot of these things are using pain compliance, and there's no way around the fact that if you're deliberately causing your animal pain on a repeated basis, especially when you've not tried other avenues of helping alter their behavior, like through training and whatnot, which a lot of people don't. It's so common on horse groups and just within barns for people to be like, my horse is having like XYZ behavioral problem under saddle. What bits do you recommend? And they immediately go to thinking it's an equipment-based fix rather than exploring why their horse is exhibiting that behavior in the first place. And it's a very lazy and self-centered way of addressing behavioral problems. And again, this is something that I used to do all the time. Like I was that person. So it's not like judging those people, but I'm just saying like at face value, this is what their behavior is. And I'm saying it without judgment, because I don't think that these people are necessarily bad people. I don't think that they're doing it to be mean to their horses, but that is what their behavior is at face value. And sorry, just to backtrack for a second, to Gabrielle, who's asking, is there any appropriate social replacement for horses? I hear a lot about goats, donkeys, sheep, etc. as pasture pals. I would say like donkeys would be the closest behaviorally to horses. Those other replacements are still better than nothing, and they would be better than like a human. So I would say ideally you'd have them out with other horses, but like having them out with like another grazing type of animal is still better than nothing. But it probably isn't going to fully replace like what being able to interact with a species that communicates in the same way as them would be. But I would say like if that's all people have, like for sure do that. That's better than them being alone. Is getting them like some type of other friend that is like a similar enough type of animal where they can like be friends and wander around together and exist together. That's 100% better than them living alone. But like, yeah, back to equipment. Like a lot of the equipment we use on horses is using pain to control them. And this is the other thing where like a lot of horse people like gaslight themselves into believing things that like are not true. Like saying, oh, like if horses didn't want to, they wouldn't. That's not true. If that was true, we wouldn't need all of this equipment on the market to make them do things that they don't want to do. Like there's so much tack and equipment on the market that is literally to make horses do things when they don't want to do them. And also, if that were true, it would mean that like as soon as someone's horse refuses to jump, you would stop trying to force them over it. You would go back to basics and get them comfortable doing it on the ground or at liberty so that it's like a willing yes. Because that's the thing is if the horse does say no and you continue to ask them until they say yes, it's not that if they didn't want to that they wouldn't, it's that they have no choice, because if they say no, people are going to persist and keep pushing them until they get that yes. So it's like they don't really have a say, or they'll use increasingly harsh equipment until they get that yes. And that's like one of the things too, where it's like, regardless of how people train, I think we should be honest with ourselves about what it is that we're doing. And it's like, it's just simply untrue that horses, if they didn't want to do something, they wouldn't. And the problem with that excuse in particular is that it justifies any type of training. It justifies anything, because if you can make your horse do something, you're saying that they want to do the thing. Just on the sheer act of being able to make them do something, it means that the horse wanted to do it, because if they didn't want to, they wouldn't. And that justifies a lot of mistreatment towards horses. And it also enables people in shrugging off like how their equipment works, how the physics of their bit works, how the training gadgets that they use work. It doesn't ask them to think deeper about any of that stuff, because they're operating with the mindset of if they didn't want to, that they wouldn't. But there's a reason why so few horse people can get their horses to do most of the things that they ask them to do if you took the equipment off. Because if it was truly willing and they are doing the task sheerly out of the desire to do it, they don't need equipment to do it, or they need very minimal equipment to do it. And yes, some mystic bear said, I think we have a history of seeing horses as pieces of equipment, and that bleeds into modern riding and training, especially when people at the high level then is, yeah, I agree. And they were work animals. We literally built this world using horses until machinery took over. And like when you need them for those types of crucial things, like feeding your family and like building your house and farming and stuff, you don't really have room to consider how the horse feels about things, because regardless of how the horse feels, you need those things to be done. And also, people knew a lot less about horses back then. But when they were being used as the primary means of transport and moving equipment and building stuff and like being like quite literally the horsepower behind everything, we didn't have the same room to consider their feelings, because there was more necessity behind the tasks that they were being asked to do. It's the same thing as like when they're being used as war horses. Guaranteed, none of those horses wanted to be in an active battlefield. None of them. They just had to be there out of necessity, and they are very resilient animals. And I think that's one thing that we should look at horses and be amazed by, is how resilient they are. They can be in really awful circumstances that are highly stressful and extremely unpleasant for anyone, but especially a flight animal. And they have no context as to why they're there, but they learn how to cope with it. But that doesn't mean that they're thriving or anywhere close to it. But since we use horses as equipment, I do think that that's influenced the training tactics that we use, as well as the equipment, because they were essentially machinery to us for so many years. And I think that that's another thing that a lot of people need to reflect on, is that a lot of training is going to be influenced from that mindset, because that's where the training of horses started from. So a lot of the people who have passed down training knowledge over generations and belief systems about horses over generations, if it's really old mindsets, it's going to be coming from that era of horsemanship, where horses were tools and where there was less room to consider their feelings, and where it was mostly based off of whether or not you could get the results that you're after, regardless of how those results are achieved. And I think that's really important. Another thing to note too is that, like, I see, this is where also the disconnect is. I see a lot of horse people living in first world countries where they have all of their needs met, where they have cars and machinery to get around, being extremely judgmental about third world countries. And I've had this like, to answer people's questions, if anyone's ever done this, I've been sent a lot of clips and videos of horses from really like people who are living in poverty, and they'll be like, why don't you talk about abuse like this? And it's like, there is a huge difference between someone using a horse in a manner that is harmful out of desperation to stay alive because it is their only option, and privileged people here in Western countries using horses for competition and enjoyment. So it is not on the same line. And I also find that it encourages a lot of racism when people go into that type of discussion. So that's why I've avoided talking about stuff like that, because there's a massive difference between using horses out of necessity when you have no other options and when you're struggling to survive, and using them for pleasure and enjoyment in competition. And there are very few people here in like Canada and the US and throughout most of Europe and in like that are actually using horses out of like the absolute need to rely on them to survive. Um, and there's a huge difference. So I focus on how people are treating them in situations where it's not crucial to use them, where it is just it's a choice. It's for enjoyment. You're getting them as like a companion and to enjoy in sport. It should be really no different than if you get a dog and you're doing dog sports with them. But the thing with dogs is that it's a lot more common to try to utilize their natural drive and use rewards-based systems to increase that drive and give them like a task. Whereas with horses, it's only become more common in very recent years to use rewards-based systems with them. And like that is also the key too, is when we're trying to say that if they didn't want to, they wouldn't. When we're using training systems that are reliant on utilizing forms of discomfort, be it minor irritation or actual physical pain, when that is the primary system in place for reinforcing behavior and getting them to do things for us, it is very difficult to look at that and go, oh, like if they didn't want to, they wouldn't, because they don't really have a choice. You just keep applying an irritating pressure either at the same level, but oftentimes you escalate it until they finally answer. And then they learn effectively, like, okay, like I really don't like the way this is making me feel. And if I want to escape this bad feeling, this is what I need to do. And they're not doing it because they want to do the thing. They're doing it because they find doing the thing less uncomfortable than what the alternative is. And they, generally speaking, don't really have choice. And like, this is also why we need to look at the equipment people are using to ride horses and get them to do things. Is the more equipment you need, the more clear it is that your horse really doesn't have a choice. And it's not even like a lot of people will try to justify equipment and be like, not all horses can go in a soft snaffle, not all horses can go bitless. I beg to differ. I think all of them can. All horses at any, no matter what, they're stronger than us. They can overpower us if they choose to. If you're relying on trying to work a horse through excessive levels of stress, and you're not dealing with those levels of stress, yes, you are going to need more equipment to control them, because their adrenaline is going to numb any pain that they feel, and they're more likely to run through equipment and also react in a dangerous way. But that does not mean that the equipment is like that the horse needs the equipment. And like that's another excuse that is used to justify the means to the end, is where people go, oh well, like he needs this bit, this is what he goes best in. And it's like, I think we should reframe the thinking, is the equipment that riders use is what they need. It's not what the horse needs, because the horse already knows how to be a horse. It's what they need to get the job done. And it is on them to learn how to do it with less, especially once you find out how the equipment that you're using works and whether or not it's painful to the horse. It is on the rider to learn how to do things differently. And it's really important for people to know that their inability to do something currently does not mean it's not possible. Their inability to get a certain result with a horse does not mean it's not possible. It doesn't mean that someone else couldn't. I have yet to discover any horse that I could not get to go bitless. Like none. Absolutely none. And like I firmly am in the camp that it's like, people claiming that some horses just need harsh equipment in order to be ridden and worked, I think that they're wrong. But also, like, even in the, if there is a case where that's true, then I think we should be questioning whether or not that horse should be ridden, if they need to have that level of coercion in order to be doing what the rider asks. And like those are the questions we should be asking ourselves, rather than just justifying whatever it takes, because horses don't need to go to shows. They don't, your horse doesn't need to be a show jumper. It doesn't need to be a dressage horse. It's what the rider wants. And we need to be more conscious of looking at like what methods we're using to create that outcome, and whether or not it's fair to the horse. Because if you can only do that off of like causing your horse high levels of stress and using very coercive or painful equipment, then should the horse be doing that type of activity? Is it like necessary? No, it never is, because competition is not a need, it's a want. Um, And that's also why I think that there's a higher standard of care that people have to provide. And that's also why I think it's a cop out for people to look at these upper level sport horses and go, oh, they're treated like royalty, like they have the best of the best care. And it's like, the best of the best to who, though? Because if the people think it's the best of the best just because they're paying a lot of money for it and it's like a fancy barn, that doesn't really matter. Like, is it actually meeting all of the needs of the horse? And a lot of the time, it's not. So it's like it's the best of the best from the person's perspective. And most of the care that they're spending money on is in accordance to get the horse prepped for competition, like getting your horse like body work and like pemp therapy and like the best type of shoes and like all of these things that they do. Most of it is to keep the horse going in competition. It's not because the horse necessarily needs it to be a healthy horse. It's because they need it to keep the horse going in competition. So in that case, it's not actually what's in the horse's best interest. It's what's in the best interest of keeping that horse in competition. um, and I think that when we have people who are riding at the upper levels, who are at a high level of privilege, who generally speaking have lots of money behind them backing what they're doing, there is more of a standard that they need to meet for care. Otherwise, they don't deserve to be at that level. And like that's just it. I don't care that the horse is getting all these fancy treatments. No amount of fancy treatment is going to like cover up a horse not having access to friends, freedom, and forage. None of that stuff is going to change the fact that a lot of these horses have very obvious indicators of chronic stress. None of that's going to change the fact that a lot of these horses are having to be shown in really, really harsh equipment in order to be controlled. None of that's going to change the fact that a lot of these horses look miserable during competition and are showing like tons of stress behaviors. None of the expensive stuff and the amount of money put into them and how expensive the horse is and how prestigious the rider is cancels out those things. And I'm at the point now where it's like, I don't really care who someone, they could freaking be the queen of the entire world and they could have won every competition there is to win on horseback. And it doesn't change the fact that if their horse is not getting social turnout or doesn't have access to forage or doesn't have freedom or is being ridden in really painful equipment, it doesn't change the fact that that stuff's not in the horse's best interest. And just to be entirely blunt, it's never in the horse's best interest to use a harsher bit. That is never what is in the horse's best interest. What would be in the horse's best interest would be, why do you feel the need to use that equipment? What behaviors are existing that are causing problems? Why are those behaviors existing? Let's address factors that contribute to those behaviors so that those behaviors stop existing, instead of just grabbing the next harshest piece of equipment that you can and using that to suppress the behavior, because the behavior is still there. The only thing stopping it from happening and escalating to a dangerous point is the fact that the equipment hurts enough that the horse has decided it's not worth it to keep escalating and they back off. That's the only thing that stopped the behavior. It's not the fact that like the underlying reason behind the behavior appearing has been addressed. And it's not even about expecting perfection, because like, yes, horses can have bad days no matter how many of their needs are met and no matter how kind and calm their training typically is. They could have a day where they're responding in a more erratic way, and it could be because of environmental factors. It could be because they're just not feeling well that day. It could be because of a lot of things. But I think that the thing to look at is like the repeat behaviors that we see in a lot of these upper level competition horses, where people are just like, oh, haha, they're so quirky. Like, there's a lot of show jumping stallions who are like bucking throughout their courses all the time and have like this one's retired, and I can't remember if he's a stallion or not, but like Rothschild, for example, and like people might get mad at me for this because they're like, we love McLean Ward. I don't care. He showed with his ears pinned flat back the entire time, swishing his tail and often like bucking and stuff throughout the course. I don't care who is on the horse. That is not a happy horse. And it like writing it off as quirks just because he's talented at what he does. It's like the horse is talented and amazing despite whatever discomfort is creating those behaviors. They're not talented and amazing because of it. They're talented and amazing in spite of that, and they probably would be even better if they weren't under such chronic stress. And it doesn't really matter who the rider is. It doesn't matter how much money they're spending on like vet care or anything. It's like you can never fully rule out pain. And like people who have chronic issues can attest to this. And like humans can tell a doctor straight up, here is where I hurt. Here are my symptoms. here is what I've been feeling, here is when it happens. And even then, you sometimes cannot get a diagnosis, but it doesn't change the fact that you're still feeling all of those symptoms. And so, like, horses can't tell us any of those things. And our inability to find a source of the problem does not necessarily mean it's not physical. Of course, there can be other reasons why the horse is behaving that way, but like putting all of the faith in vets to discover an issue does not mean that there's not an issue there, because there can still be very clear issues, and it just might not be somewhere that's easy to image. It might be something that you can't find out until the horse dies and you do a necropsy. Like you don't necessarily know what is under the surface. And what it is reliant on is like just giving the horse the benefit of the doubt. If they're telling you something and something's stressing them out, it's like clearly there is something there. Sorry, dude, I'm gonna adjust how I'm sitting. Just like, stop it, I was sleeping. But yeah, like, we put too much faith in upper level riders and their ability to like fit their saddles and do all these things, and just assume that because they're an upper level rider that they're doing all these things and they have the best access to vets and that they've done the due diligence of checking all these things. And the assumption is there just because of who they are. And I think that is inherently flawed, because we're letting people get to a certain level of status and prestige in the horse world and then completely blindly trusting their ability to do everything. And also blindly trusting their ability to learn about horse behavior and to actually like apply what is learned, and also like their level of knowledge in general. People are just assuming that they couldn't have gotten to that level without any of that stuff, despite all of the evidence that is not true. And it's really frustrating because it doesn't allow for any forward movement in the horse world, because when those people are given that level of power, they will yield it very happily, and they will use it to shrug off like criticisms that are like justified from other people, and just be like, oh, well, like, you can't compete at this level, so what you say doesn't matter. And it's like, we're not talking about how to actually like compete at a Grand Prix show jumping course or a Grand Prix dressage test, or how to actually ride the horse through those things. We're talking about the horse's well-being, which is like it just is what it is. Like, you could do all of these things and you can be successful at the upper levels and the horse can be miserable. We've seen that time and time again. And there's a lot of scholarly evidence in studies showing that like a lot of elite sport horses are highly stressed. So they can compete and they can win despite showing signs of stress, because the current standards of competition are not weeding those things out. So looking at horses being successful in competition and using that as the sole measure of how happy they are, how sound they are, how physically comfortable they are overall is so flawed. And all it is doing is enabling people in overlooking all of those things and not having to improve their horsemanship or modernize their understanding of horse behavior. And it's very frustrating. Like, I will never compete at the Grand Prix level. I won't. And like, I'm not going to tell them how to ride a Grand Prix dressage test, but if their horse has a blue tongue in that test and has like a insanely stressed face, I can look at that and go, that horse is stressed. That's unethical. I don't think that horse should be there. And that doesn't mean that I think I'm a better rider than those people. Like, I would say I'm a better rider in the sense that I wouldn't put my horse through that degree of stress. And if I found out, like, if I saw in a picture that my horse had a blue tongue ever, I would be horrified. And that would be something that wouldn't be a repeat occurrence. Meanwhile, a lot of these riders do have repeat occurrences of this. And like, that's the thing, is this information is out there and accessible enough that these riders, that especially the ones in like dressage that we're seeing ride extremely behind the vertical and whatnot, like, they are choosing to continue doing that despite all the information that's easily accessible for them, showing why that's wrong. So regardless of whether or not they've looked at it, I don't care. They know the information is out there and they're choosing to continue staying in denial and train in a certain way because that's what serves them the best. And the other thing that I think we should note with like upper level competition riders as a whole is like, I can't think off the top of my head of anyone at the upper levels of competition in like any, especially in the Olympic sports, that has actually advocated for horse welfare in a big way and talked about science-based training and exposed that, because they won't, because one, it would alienate them from their peers, and also it would expose probably some of their own practices and like the lack of consistency in what they view and versus what they're actually doing. But like that's another thing to look at is like these people who are role models, they should also be being advocates, and they're not. They have huge platforms and they could be doing a lot of positive change for the horse world. And if they did say anything, a lot of things would change faster, but they choose not to, despite their level of access, despite how many people they have following them, and despite how closely linked they and aligned they would be with like the people who are actually in charge of the upper levels of the sport. A big name rider saying like this is wrong, like they're rewarding hyperflexion insanely at an insanely high rate in dressage. I see it all the time in the warm-up ring, and this is wrong. Someone coming out and saying that would be it would create big waves in the horse world, but they're not doing it because they care more about protecting themselves and their friends than they do about protecting the horses. So regardless of what riders you like, I would encourage you to look at like how they're engaging in advocacy and what they're actually doing with their platforms, and consider the fact that like choosing to be neutral and impartial is still a choice, and they've chosen a side even if they're trying to be neutral and not say that. Choosing a side when there's like a ton of corruption and cruelty towards horses ongoing in the industry, choosing to stay silent is a choice, and it's indicative of like what is truly important to them, because they're also seeing the rate of that cruelty at a much higher rate than like the average person who's not in the warm-up arena or behind the scenes at those shows. Like they know way more, and they're choosing to stay silent. And that's something that I will judge people for, because if they have a huge platform and they could be saying things, it's like you're not going to lose that much of your following if you've already established a following of like 500,000 people or like 200, 300,000 people or whatever. It's like it's not going to hurt you that much. And even if it did, like if you're truly in the sport for the love of the horses, like why aren't you doing anything? Anyways, I gotta run. Thank you for listening, everyone. I'm gonna leave this live if people want to like look at the beginning, but that's my rant for the day. I'm gonna try to film more videos in the future, but I've just been really busy and life has just been a lot lately. So we will see how that if that actually happens. But I'm planning to. But the winter's hard for me, especially after daylight saving times ends. So, anyways, see you later. Bye, everybody. Have a great day. Hope everyone's doing well.